The course design process kicks off by focusing on learning outcomes. This course design process is going to apply concepts of constructive alignment and various frameworks of teaching and learning to help you plan the major components of your course. So those components being the assessments and the activities that students engage in, all aligned to the intentions for students' learning. In other words, the learning outcomes. Learning outcomes are statements of the knowledge, skills, and values that students are expected to develop by taking your course. Whether you are new to writing learning outcomes for your course or you've got a pre-existing set of outcomes that you're utilizing in transitioning your course to online, this video is going to orient you to going through those outcomes, maybe creating or revising them as a starting point for that rapid transition to the online environment. Arguably, the intended outcomes you expect students to achieve in that face-to-face environment should not be all that different from what you expect moving your course to the online. However, this is a really great opportunity to pause and reflect on what's essential. What must students walk away with from the course having demonstrated? In other words, what are the key integrated and essential elements of learning? This is really the focus of learning outcomes. By nature, learning outcomes are student-focused. They describe the end state or the final expectation of what students should be able to know, do, or value by the end of their time in the course. Outcomes also describe the depth of learning expected. While there are no hard rules around the number of learning outcomes for a given course, typically you may hear the numbers 5 to 7 learning outcomes being aimed for as a general guideline. So any more than that, and the question sort of becomes what is truly essential in describing the overall learning outcomes of the course, and have those learning outcomes been integrated and kind of boiled down enough to truly represent what students, that lasting sense of learning and ability that students are coming away from the course with. Learning outcomes tend to follow a typical template that can be really helpful not only for writing learning outcomes, but also for reviewing them. An outcome typically starts with a stem, such as this. By the end of the course, students will be able to. It's then followed by an action verb that describes that depth of learning. So in this case, are students being asked to identify or analyze, apply or evaluate? You can start to sense the difference. Following that, there's some explanation of what the learning is that's meant to be demonstrated. So possibly a statement as to what kind of learning and also the why or the how. This part of the outcome elaborates on the learning in terms of what's expected and why it's important or how it's meant to be demonstrated. So here's an example. Students will be able to analyze the research design of a peer-reviewed zoological article in order to critically evaluate scientific rigor. I always emphasize finding the right verb because it can go a long way in describing the nature of learning. Accompanying this video is a resource titled Learning Outcomes Verbs for Drafting. This resource organizes a huge amount of action verbs, all based on various levels or taxonomies of learning. This can be a great resource in finding the perfect verb to describe the targeted learning. I often recommend trying on various verbs, so I tend to go through this list and try out the different verbs in describing what I want students to be able to accomplish. Do I want students to be able to describe something, or do I expect them to possibly recognize? Do I want them to compare, or do I want them to translate? Trying out these different verbs tends to help me settle into the right fit. Whether you've recently drafted your outcomes or you're looking back on outcomes that you have previously written for a course, be sure to take a moment to critically review what you've got. Questions like these: do the statements focus on student learning? Do the action verbs convey the targeted depth or focus of learning? Is the list comprehensive in describing that those essential elements of the course that students are gaining? Do the outcomes describe the disciplinary context or answer the question of why and how learning is to be demonstrated? A more fulsome list of evaluative questions for consideration are provided as an accompanying resource to this video. A third resource that you will find is a Word document called a constructive alignment chart. This chart puts to practice the ideas of constructive alignment where you can start to map out that connection between learning outcomes, assessments, and teaching and learning activities. This can be really helpful in working through this alignment chart, particularly as you're transitioning from face-to-face to online context, as using this resource, you might be in a better position to more rapidly and effectively make decisions about what is absolutely essential for creating that course online. The first step in using this alignment chart is to download the document, of course, and add your drafted and refined learning outcomes to the far left corner of the chart. Subsequent videos in this course design series will build on the alignment chart as we consider that connection between the outcomes, assessments, and activities. So here's the example of our drafted outcome being added to the alignment chart. Before you move on to the next step in the course design process, be sure to draft or refine your outcomes and add them to your constructive alignment chart. Use the checklist to revise and refine your outcomes as you go along, as this is always an iterative process of checking back on your outcomes to make sure they really are describing the nature of your course.